Ridgeview Heights, Valerie's Kingdom. Ridgeview Heights was a high-end gated community on the outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia, a place where luxury was the bare minimum. Mansions ranged from $2 million to $5 million. Everyone here was either upper middle class or straight up wealthy, and at the top of this social food chain was Valerie Thompson. She had no official title, but that everyone knew she ran this neighborhood. If Valerie didn't like you, the HOA, Homeowners Association, would find a reason to make your life hell. If Valerie spread a rumor about you, good luck getting invited to another neighborhood gathering. She had power, and she knew how to use it. Valerie's lavish life. Valerie didn't work. She didn't have to. Her husband, Richard Thompson, was a senior financial director at Graves Enterprises, pulling in $480,000 a year. On top of that, he received an annual bonus between $100,000 and $300,000 depending on company performance. That meant Valerie had at least $40,000 a month to spend however she pleased. $10,000 went to designer clothes, Gucci, Chanel, Hermes, Prada. $5,000 on beauty treatments, Botox, spa days, hairstyling at the most exclusive salons. Lunch with her wealthy friends? At least $500 per meal. Her life was funded entirely by her husband's paycheck, but Valerie saw it as an entitlement, not a privilege. She never imagined that one day it could all be taken away. The entitlement of a queen. Valerie believed the world was naturally divided into two kinds of people. People like her, wealthy, powerful, and superior, and everyone else, people who didn't belong in her world. She didn't scream racist slurs or make it obvious. No, Valerie's racism was more subtle. She was the type to politely call the police when she saw a black man walking through the neighborhood. She would emphasize words like educated and classy when describing white people, but say things like surprisingly well-spoken about black people. And if she saw a black man driving a luxury car, oh, he definitely had to be a drug dealer. She couldn't stand the idea of a black person being more successful than her. And whenever she had the opportunity, she made sure to remind them of their place. If a black family moved into Ridgeview Heights, she found ways to drive them out. If a black man sat at an upscale restaurant, she assumed he was out of place. If a black woman wore designer brands, she was probably spending welfare checks. The day that changed everything. It was a bright, sunny afternoon. Valerie was heading to lunch at Rutherford's, a five-star restaurant in the city. This was her usual spot where she and her friends gossiped over $350 lunches. The crowd here was exclusively upper class, doctors, lawyers, business owners, and rich housewives like Valerie. Everything was going perfectly until he walked in. Valerie's eyes locked onto him instantly. Tall, well-dressed, but not flashy, a perfectly tailored suit, a Patek Philippe watch worth over $100,000, and a quiet but commanding presence. And, most infuriatingly, he walked in like he belonged there. She tensed. Her grip on her wine glass tightened. A black man sitting at a VIP table, being greeted with respect by the staff. That wasn't how the world was supposed to work. Valerie leaned toward her friends and sneered. Since when do they let just anyone in here? She didn't whisper. She wanted him to hear. She wanted everyone to hear. She smirked, looking him up and down. Let me guess, rapper or athlete. Her friends giggled, entertained by her clever remark. But the man, he didn't react. He didn't even look in her direction. He just sat down, opened his menu, and went on with his day. And that made Valerie absolutely furious. She couldn't let it go. She was about to do something that would completely destroy her life. Valerie can't let it go. Valerie couldn't focus on her lunch anymore. The man was still sitting there, completely unbothered, flipping through the menu like he owned the place. The waiters treated him with the kind of respect that was usually reserved for doctors, CEOs, and old money elites. And worst of all, no one else seemed to have a problem with it. That was unacceptable. Valerie clenched her jaw. She couldn't just sit there and let this happen. She had to put him in his place. She was about to teach this nobody a lesson he'd never forget. The first attack, subtle but sharp. Valerie dramatically waved over the nearest waiter. The young server rushed to her table, nervously smiling. "Yes, ma'am, is everything okay?" She leaned in slightly, pretending to whisper, but her voice was loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "I'm just a little confused." She gestured toward the man's table with a fake smile. "Did he win some kind of contest? A giveaway?" The waiter blinked. I don't understand, ma'am." Valerie forced a laugh. "Well, because this is the VIP section, isn't it? It's usually reserved for—" She paused dramatically, looking around the room. "You know, people who belong here." Her friends giggled. A few people at nearby tables glanced over. The waiter cleared his throat. "Ma'am, that gentleman is actually a valued guest." "A valued guest?" Valerie cut him off, raising her eyebrows in exaggerated surprise. "Oh, that's adorable." The waiter shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, he— So what does he do?" Valerie interrupted again. "Let me guess. Sports?" Her friends laughed harder, and finally the man looked up. The calm before the storm. His eyes met Valerie's, calm but sharp, like a lion sizing up its prey. He set his menu down, took a slow sip of his wine, and then smiled. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" His voice was deep, controlled, like a man who was used to being in charge. Valerie smirked. "Not at all. I was just curious how you managed to get in here." "I walked through the front door," he said simply. Her smirk widened. "Of course you did. But I mean, what do you do? Rap? Basketball?" But he didn't. Instead, he just smiled wider. "Why do you ask?" And that was the moment she sealed her fate, the brutal reveal. The man leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "My name is Malcolm Graves." He let it sit there for a moment, watching her reaction. "And," he continued, "I'm the CEO of Graves Enterprises." Boom! The air seemed to shift. Valerie's smile faltered, just for a second, but she quickly forced it back. Malcolm reached into his suit pocket, pulled out a sleek black metal business card, and slid it across the table. Valerie glanced down. "Malcolm Graves, CEO, Graves Enterprises." Valerie's stomach dropped. It was real. All of it. She had just humiliated the CEO of the company that put food on her table. The man who had the power to fire her husband with a single phone call. Valerie had just destroyed her own life, and she didn't even know it yet. Valerie's brain goes into panic mode. For the first time in her life, Valerie felt powerless. She sat frozen, staring at Malcolm's business card. Her mind was scrambling for an excuse, any excuse to make this not real. This couldn't be happening. Not to her. She had humiliated the one man who could single-handedly destroy her entire life. But instead of admitting she had lost, she made a fatal decision. She decided to fight back. Valerie's pathetic attempt at control. Valerie forced a laugh, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "Oh, please, this is ridiculous," she scoffed. "This is clearly some kind of setup." Malcolm raised an eyebrow, amused. "A setup?" "Yes," she snapped. "You're probably some scammer trying to blackmail me. Just because you printed out a fancy little card doesn't mean I'm stupid enough to believe you." Malcolm tilted his head, looking at her like she was a slow child. "You think I'm scamming you?" he asked. Valerie folded her arms. "Obviously." Malcolm let out a deep, amused chuckle. "All right." He pulled out his phone, tapped a few buttons, then turned it around to show her. It was the official Graves Enterprises website. His face, his name, his title, CEO. Then he swiped to another screen, a Forbes article from 2 months ago. Malcolm Graves, the billionaire investor who built his empire from scratch. Her mouth went dry. And so she made her final, most humiliating mistake. She smirked. Nice Photoshop work, but I don't fall for fakes. A few people in the restaurant gasped. Malcolm's expression didn't change, but the air around him did. For the first time, he looked bored. "You're not very bright, are you?" he said. Valerie's stomach dropped. Malcolm stood up, adjusting his cufflinks. "Let me make this easier for you." He tapped his phone again, held it up to his ear. A deep male voice answered immediately. "Mr. Graves, sir." "James," Malcolm said casually, "is Richard Thompson still employed at my company?" There was a short silence. Then, "Yes, sir, he's scheduled for a performance review next week." "Interesting," Malcolm said, "because I just had a very unpleasant interaction with his wife." Valerie had just set her husband up for a direct meeting with the one man who could fire him on the spot. Malcolm slipped his phone back into his pocket, giving her one last look. "Good luck, Valerie," he said smoothly. "You're going to need it." Then he picked up his glass of wine, took a sip, and left. Valerie runs home to Richard, but it's already too late. Valerie flew out of the restaurant, heart pounding. She had to get to Richard before Malcolm did. She burst into the house, storming into his office. Richard was at his desk, sipping a glass of whiskey. "Richard, you won't believe what just happened," she shrieked. Richard calmly swirled his drink. "Oh, I already know." On the screen was a viral video, her humiliating herself in the restaurant. Valerie's entire body went cold. "Richard, You ruined me," Richard said quietly, standing up. "Do you even understand what you've done?" Valerie opened her mouth, but he cut her off. "I just got an email from HR. I have a meeting with Malcolm Graves tomorrow. They're letting me go." Valerie's world crashed, and this was only the beginning. From a mansion to a slum. 3 months after Richard left, Valerie was living in a tiny one-bedroom apartment in a low-income neighborhood. The rent was barely $900, but she still struggled to pay it. She had no job, no savings, and no one left to call for help. She was living in the kind of place she once looked down on. Her days were filled with rejection emails from jobs she wasn't qualified for. Her nights were spent scrolling through social media, watching her old friends live their best lives without her. Richard had moved on, already engaged to a younger woman. The world had forgotten about Valerie Thompson. Running into Malcolm, the last straw. One rainy afternoon, Valerie left a discount grocery store carrying a plastic bag of cheap canned food. Her hair was unwashed, her clothes wrinkled, and her face was gaunt from stress. And then she saw him. A sleek black Rolls-Royce was parked by the curb. The door opened, and out stepped Malcolm Graves, still powerful, still successful, completely untouched by what had happened. He barely glanced at her before shutting his car door. To him, she wasn't even worth acknowledging. But to Valerie, this was the final insult. All the anger, all the resentment, all the bitterness she had been holding inside erupted. Her fingers clenched around her plastic bag, her vision blurred with rage. And then she snapped. Valerie attacks Malcolm in public. "You ruined my life," Valerie screamed, swinging the grocery bag at Malcolm's head. He sidestepped effortlessly. The bag flew past him, spilling cheap cans onto the pavement. But she wasn't done. She lunged again, clawing at him like a wild animal. Malcolm didn't even flinch. He simply took a step back, letting her humiliate herself. By now, people had started watching. Some pulled out their phones. Valerie didn't care. She wanted him to suffer. She wanted him to feel what she felt. "You think you're better than me?" she shrieked. "You think you can just destroy me and walk away?" She swung her fist at his face. And that was it. The second her knuckles grazed his suit, two security guards tackled her to the ground. A police siren cut through the air. Moments later, two officers yanked her off the ground and slapped handcuffs onto her wrists. "Ma'am, you are under arrest for assault and battery." Valerie had just thrown away her last chance at redemption. The trial. Valerie faces justice. 2 weeks later, Valerie sat in court wearing an orange jumpsuit. Her once pristine hair was now greasy and pulled into a limp ponytail. Her expensive jewelry had been replaced with metal handcuffs. She looked across the courtroom. Malcolm sat calmly, watching the trial unfold with complete disinterest. The prosecutor played the video evidence on the big screen. The whole world saw her attack him like a wild animal. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was emotionless. "Valerie Thompson, you are sentenced to 3 years in prison for aggravated assault." The courtroom buzzed. The judge banged his gavel. Valerie's mouth opened, but no words came out. No, this isn't fair," she finally screamed. "He's the one who—" "Silence!" The judge's voice was final. "Take her away. She was just another convict." Final encounter with Malcolm. As she was being led out, she saw Malcolm one last time. She expected him to smirk, to gloat, to say something cruel. But instead, he just looked at her, calm, unaffected. And then he simply said one thing: "You did this to yourself." Because to Malcolm, she wasn't even worth remembering. Prison, her final humiliation. Valerie sat in her prison cell, staring at the cracked concrete walls. Her bright orange jumpsuit was too big, hanging off her once-toned body like a cheap costume. The luxury, the power, the status, everything was gone. She had spent her life believing she was above everyone else. Now she was just another inmate, another forgotten face in a sea of criminals. Her cellmate, a burly woman named Letitia, smirked from the top bunk. "Damn, Karen, life comes at you fast, huh?" Valerie didn't respond. She had learned quickly that talking back only got her beaten. She wasn't in control here. She never would be again. This was her new reality, and no one cared. Abandoned by everyone. Months passed, then years, and not once did Valerie receive a letter, a call, or a visitor. Her children never came. Richard never wrote. Her former friends had long since blocked her number and deleted her from their lives. She used to be feared. Now she was forgotten. She overheard a guard one day talking about Ridgeview Heights. Apparently someone had moved into her old mansion. A young black couple, doctors, who fit the elite mold better than she ever did. No one even remembered that she had once ruled that neighborhood. She had been erased, and that was worse than any prison sentence. The day she finally broke. One night, Valerie sat in the prison yard staring at the full moon. She used to sit in her luxurious backyard sipping wine under this same ski. Now she sat on a splintered wooden bench, surrounded by barbed wire. For the first time, she admitted something to herself. "I did this. Not Malcolm, not Richard, not society. Her. She had been given every opportunity in life, and she had thrown it all away out of arrogance and hatred. This was her fate, and she had earned every second of it." Meanwhile, Malcolm never looks back. Outside those prison walls, Malcolm Graves never thought about her again. His company grew larger. His wealth multiplied. His legacy was cemented. He had already erased her from his mind the moment she was taken away in handcuffs. And that was the real punishment. Valerie had spent years obsessing over him, blaming him for everything. But to him, she was nothing. She wasn't a rival. She wasn't an enemy. She was just a bad memory. And that was the final nail in her coffin. The final scene, her last day of prison. 3 years later, Valerie was released. No reporters, no cameras, no one waiting for her. She stepped out of those gates with nothing but a plastic bag holding her belongings. She looked at her reflection in a bus stop window, wrinkled, gray-haired, eyes empty. She used to be someone. Now she was nobody. For the first time in her life, she truly understood what it meant to be invisible. She had spent years making people feel small. Now the world had made her the smallest of all. Her fate wasn't death. It was something worse. She was nothing. The end. Valerie didn't die. She didn't get revenge. She simply stopped mattering.